Good morning, everyone. This is Tracy Gruber of the Department of Workforce Services. Thank you for joining our pre-bidders meeting on the Intergenerational Poverty Plan Implementation Pilot Program request for grant application. We're going to spend some time this morning going through the packet and telling you the components of the application, answer any questions that you might have. There is, just in terms of housekeeping, we are recording this, so it will be posted for later listening for people who weren't able to join or who want to listen to it again. We also, just in terms of asking questions, you do have a feature in your GoToMeeting where you can enter your questions into the chat feature, and we will be monitoring the questions on our end so that we can answer them. All of your phones are muted and they will stay muted throughout the call this morning. I just want to do a few introductions and then we will get started. As I said, I'm Tracy Gruber. I've met many of you before. I'm the advisor on the Intergenerational Poverty Initiative, as well as the director for the Office of Child Care. Staff within the initiative will be helping to monitor these contracts and participate in the scoring of the applications and the grant awards. I'm joined by Kim Carter. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am a contract analyst with the Department of Workforce Services.
And Kara Blackstock.
I am the administrative assistant for the Intergenerational Poverty Initiative and for Tracy Gruber.
And then we also are very excited to have TJ Siegmiller join our team. TJ is based out of our Cedar City office, and he's going to be the program specialist over the Intergenerational Poverty County initiatives. He is on the call, but his phone is muted. TJ is currently a family employment program counselor. He has years of experience working with vulnerable populations, and he will begin doing this work as of July 1st. We think that that's going to help support the counties that are receiving the grant and all of the other county related activities taking place throughout the state around intergenerational poverty. So as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat feature on the GoToMeeting. We are recording this, and we will make that recording available. So without further ado, I am going to start by going over what's in the RFGA grant application, the request for grant applications packet that you all should have been able to download off of our website or through the link that we sent the email to you in, I don't know, about a week and a half ago. The first part of the application packet is the application itself. It provides some background over the grant process and what the grant money can be used for and what our expectations are. It gives the minimum requirements, which we will go through in greater detail. It talks about who can apply for grant funds, the close connection to the expected measurements and outcomes that have been established by the statewide Intergenerational Welfare Reform Commission, and making sure that your county plans are aligning with that, while also identifying measures that you will be tracking based on the specifics of your particular grant application. And then some instructions on where you can have your questions answered. Your questions will go to Kim Carter. She introduced herself at the beginning. She will work with TJ and myself to get your questions answered as they come through. For purposes of a little bit of background, I think everybody knows that this funding is coming through the Department of Workforce Services from the Utah legislature. There was very specific legislation that instructed the design of this grant application, and that was in House Bill 326. So if you're interested in knowing exactly what was in that legislation, I encourage you to look on the legislative webpage and look up House Bill 326. And you should be able to see that the grant application very closely aligns with how that legislation was written. So if there's questions about why it's written the way that it is, it might be informative for you to look at that bill. The other thing in the packet is really detailed information on the application process. This is a competitive grant. There is not unlimited funding for everybody to get funded, which means that the application process is incredibly important, and making sure that you follow it closely is critical in making sure that we can even read your grant application. So you'll want to pay particular attention to that. We do give you a submission checklist to make sure that you are submitting all of your required components of the grant application. Then there is a cover page, and we're going to go through all of this. I'm just giving an overview of what's in the packet. There's a grant application narrative, which asks a number of questions that you and your county team will have to fill out. It's that application that we will be utilizing to score the award and whether or not your county receives an award. There's also a budget form that needs to be completed and filled out. Our grant terms and conditions that Kim is going to go over as well. And the grant scope of work. So, oh, thank you. The scope of work is basically the contract component of the contract, which talks about the delivery of the activities that your county will need to be engaged in. It gets in pretty high level detail. And then the last attachment, or one of the last attachments, is the evaluation score sheet. And that's a scoring rubric that we will be using to score each county's application out of a potential points, total points of 100. So you'll want to pay very close attention to that score sheet as you're writing your application to make sure that you're going to get the points that we are looking at and weighting as the independent review panel looks at the application. And that is important for me to note. There is an independent review panel that will read these applications. Probably no fewer than 3 readers on each application, and probably no more than 4. And that makes sure that the review is independent, and the scoring committees then get together and go over the scores before the awards are given out. So that's the high level overview for the application. I'm gonna go on to the next slide and we'll just dive right in. So the objective of the grant is that we are requesting grant applications from counties to implement local solutions to address intergenerational poverty. And we've underlined counties because that is who the type of entity that needs to apply for these funds. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go further in the application. Who may apply? Again, county or groups of counties. If you are part of a group of counties, the size or the class of your counties needs to be between the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th class. So if you're applying as a group of counties, some of the smaller counties, the only groups of counties that can apply are those counties of the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th class. If you're applying individually as a county by yourself, you can apply regardless of your size. We are required to award 1 grant, assuming that we get an applicant from a county of the 2nd class, at least 1 grant to a county of the 2nd class. Who else may apply? The counties have to have a county level plan to reduce intergenerational poverty that is either developed under the community planning grant or independently through a multi-stakeholder committee process. So just some additional information about that statement. Many of you recall that the Department of Workforce Services issued county planning grants that started in 2016, and you were required, if you received that grant, to submit to the Department of Workforce Services on June 2nd of 2017 a plan to address intergenerational poverty. So if you are a county that participated in that planning grant process and you submitted your plan to us on June 2nd of last year, you are eligible to participate. Your county is eligible to apply for these funds, as are counties that independently, without receiving the DWS planning grant, pulled together a group of multi-stakeholder group with all of the mandatory partners that were part of the planning grant, but did it on their own. They heard about what was going on and they started meeting and started pulling together the requisite stakeholders to develop their own plan. So that is a prerequisite for being able to apply for this grant. And I will emphasize again that in order to apply, the applying entity has to be a county or group of counties. It cannot be a nonprofit organization. We've gotten questions about this already. The legislation is very clear that it needs to be a county or group of counties. That does not prevent a county from subcontracting out the work to a nonprofit or maybe an institution of higher education. But in terms of which entity is applying for the funds and receiving the funds, it has to be a county or group of counties. The other requirement for applying is that the county or group of counties has to have a requisite number of children at risk of experiencing intergenerational poverty, and that's 15%, as well as at least 4% of the children identified as experiencing intergenerational poverty. So how will you find that out? Well, on the DWS Intergenerational Poverty website, intergenerationalpoverty.utah.gov, there's county data for every county in the state. And the very first page informs the data in terms of children who are at risk and the number of children who are experiencing intergenerational poverty. So that's the first criteria for who may apply for these funds. The critical deadlines I just wanted to call out independently so that they don't get lost in the rest of the information that you're going to receive. We are asking for letters of intent submitted by July 2nd at 12 p.m. And that the completed application must be submitted by July 23rd at 5 p.m. So that is, those are two important deadlines. Kim just pointed out a correction that needs to go on that web page. Your application packet says the letter of intent is due Monday, July 2nd at 5 p.m. That's the correct time. So the letter of intent submitted by July 2nd at 5 p.m. is what this PowerPoint slide should read. The completed applications must be submitted by July 23rd at noon. So those the dates are correct, but the times need to be reversed. And when we put up the PowerPoint with this recording, we'll make sure that that's corrected. Nice catch. Thank you. The minimum requirements, we've kind of gone over some of these. County or group of contiguous counties of those various class sizes, the established strategic plan, the population of children at risk of at least 15%, and children experiencing intergenerational poverty of 4%. You're going to need to submit letters of commitment from implementation committee members and letters of support from cross-agency representatives. And I will just talk briefly about the difference between the letters of commitment and the letters of support, and it is even clearer in the grant application narrative that you will be required to complete. So in the original legislation, it specifies partners that need to be involved in your county plans. Depending on what your county plan is going to focus on, it's entirely possible that all of those partners will not need to be sitting at the table on a regular basis when you're implementing your county plan. So for example, if your county plan is focused on early childhood development and you're focusing on access to high quality child care providers, it's entirely possible that you don't need a representative from your county's economic development office. But you will need a letter of support from your economic development office. So what we're saying is that all of the counties need to submit letters of support from all of the mandatory cross-agency representatives that were listed in the legislation. And that letter of support really just attests to the agency's knowledge that your county is participating in this, that they are going to be putting together a plan, and that the agencies in your county support your effort. In contrast, the letter of commitment is required of any of the mandatory partners that need to be at the table to actually implement your county plan. So again, using the example of high quality childcare, if your county plan is designed to increase the number of high quality childcare programs that are serving families experiencing intergenerational poverty, you are going to want to make sure that all of the entities responsible for early childhood in your county are actively involved in the plan implementation. And from those partners, who each county will identify, Department of Workforce Services is not identifying your committee members, your implementation committee members. That's going to be your responsibility. You will need to submit letters of commitment from all of those partners. And that letter of commitment will require those partners on an individual basis to state that they are committed to this effort, that they will be at the table when you meet, and that they will be critical to implementing your county level plan. So that's the difference between letters of commitment from the implementation committee and letters of support from the cross-agency representatives. Each cross-agency representative that we are asking for a letter of support from is listed individually in your grant application.
Okay, Tracy, I have a question. And it wants to know whether or not DWS will need to do letters of support since the funding is coming through DWS.
Oh, will you have to collect letters of support from DWS? The answer to that is yes, because the DWS staff that's in each of these counties in the field is going to want to know that the counties in which they work, just like all of the other commission member agencies, the counties of which they work are engaged, and it's also required of the legislation. So thank you for that question. And we are keeping track of the questions that are coming in. In the legislation and as part of the statewide intergenerational poverty initiatives focus and priorities, there is a very high emphasis on data and outcomes, and tracking data and measuring outcomes. So there is a lot of discussion throughout the application process and requirements in your narrative to talk about the data that the counties are going to track, discuss how they're going to be tracking it, and the systems that it will put in place to track that data. I will say that funding is available for that purpose. So as part of your county plan, if there is a need to be tracking data and you don't have a system like that, you would be able to seek funding to be able to do that. within the confines of the legislation. Systems are very expensive, and there is a cap and how much of the money can go to administration, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just want to make you aware that there is an opportunity for some of the funding to go to that. So this slide talks about the data. Counties must track data to demonstrate outcomes. The counties will have to identify indicators that will track to evaluate county level outcomes. You will have to identify which commission indicators will be tracked. Now, as a reminder, the Intergenerational Welfare Reform Commission and its 5- and 10-year plan has already identified a number of indicators in each area of child well-being, and the counties will need to identify which of those indicators will be tracked. And then the counties will be required to submit quarterly progress reports and then a comprehensive annual report. Again, the legislation requires an annual report that needs to be presented to the legislature every year. The applications themselves will have to include specific and measurable outcomes that address intergenerational poverty. They'll have to indicate that the measures identified will track progress toward the outcome. The counties will have to establish baseline measurements for each specific outcome and indicator. And the methodology, as I mentioned earlier, for tracking and validating data, and the system that will be utilized for the data tracking. We have another question that says, can DWS, the Department of Workforce Services, both submit a letter of intent and a letter of support? So DWS should not be submitting a letter of intent. The letters of intent need to come from the counties, but DWS could potentially they have to submit a letter of support. So at our local level, that there has to be a letter of support from DWS, and they may also, depending on the county plan, be part of the committee, the implementation committee. And if they're a member of the implementation committee, then the DWS staff down there in whichever county will need to also submit a letter of commitment. So I hope that answers that question. Funding. So the total grant funds that are available to award is $900,000. It's possible that if all the funds aren't expended this year, that there would be another contract release next year, but we're hoping that counties will apply for the funds this year. This money is coming to the Department of Workforce Services through the general fund, the state general fund. The grants are going to be awarded based on demonstrated need and also on filling out the application. You will see that counties are being asked to identify programs it intends to leverage, existing programs it intends to leverage to implement its plans, and also ensure that it is not duplicating any services. You know better than us what services are available in your communities, and this funding can be utilized to leverage existing services, but it should not be used to develop new programs that are duplicating services that already exist in your community. So in the application, counties are going to have to discuss that and ensure that they're not duplicating services, but are leveraging maybe some other programs that are already in place in your counties, maybe the family resource facilitator model or the after school grants that are out to many of your programs, and you will have to talk about that. Funds must be utilized during the grant period of September 1st, 2018 to August 31st of 2019. We will have grant applications in place sometime, will be circulated for execution sometime in mid to late August so that they can be executed by September 1st. Awarded counties must provide a cash or in-kind match equal to at least 25% of the grant award. So if you're asking for $100,000, the county must also put up $25,000 of the grant. And the other thing that needs to be noted, which is very important, is that there's a maximum of 10% cap on administrative costs. That 10% cap applies to both the 25% grant match amount as well as the amount being awarded by the Department of Workforce Services. So the maximum that a county can spend on administration, combining both the 25% funds coming from the county and the funds coming from the state, is 10% on administration. We do have another question that notes that the original amount appropriated was $1 million, and a question about why there's only $900,000 left to award in grants. The answer for that is because the Department of Workforce Services was given administrative costs equal, coincidentally, to the 10% that you're capped at, so that we can administer this program and monitor the funds that are coming through for this grant. So the amount of available money based on the legislation to be awarded in grants is $900,000. Good question. There is an opportunity for you to submit questions to us. Any questions must be submitted in writing by Friday, July 13th at 5 p.m. We will post all written responses to those questions by Monday, July 16th, 2018. Where would they be able to find the questions?
There is a link on the website where you find your application for questions and answers, and you can just go on there, click on it. It's updated anytime anything's added to it.
So keep an eye on that question and answer tab on the DWS website where the grant application was posted. There's a tab for Q&A, and as Kim said, they will be updated as we get questions coming in. So keep an eye on that. Chances are, if you have a question, somebody else has a question, and maybe it's been answered already. We do have the opportunity to submit addenda to the application if we find it necessary to do so. So maybe we see a correction that needs to be made or a question that we overlooked. It happens incredibly rarely, but we make sure that if we are going to submit addenda, that we impose a deadline on ourselves, and that deadline is July 16th at 5 p.m. So if there's going to be any changes to the RFGA, it will be posted no later than that date. And we'll have the letters of intent, so we'll know who's applying, and we'll make sure that you know whether or not there's been any changes to the application. We did have a question about how do you submit the questions. Those do get submitted, and there is a website on there. It goes directly to Kim. So Kim, you want to give them your email address?
My email address is kicarter, that's C-A-R-T-E-R, @utah.gov.
So K-I like igloo, Carter @utah.gov. And Kara is also putting that email in the chat feature so everybody can see it.
And it's also in the RFGA.
And it's also in the RFGA. Now it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Application process. We mentioned already letters of intent. Those letters of intent need to be submitted by July 2nd. Is that the right time? 5 p.m. on July 2nd?
Yes.
July 2nd. So now the time is right on this slide. Letters of intent by July 2nd at 5 p.m. All intent letters must be submitted by this date or applications will not be considered for funding. We have received letters of intent already, and I just want to acknowledge that some of the letters of intent were submitted by organizations and not by the counties themselves. As long as the letter of intent, this only applies for the letter of intent. As long as the letter of intent notes that the entity submitting the letter of intent is doing so on behalf of the county itself, those letters of intent will be accepted. Once it comes to the application and the counties have to identify the lead organization, that has to come from the county. So for purposes of the letter of intent, if you've already submitted it and it's coming from an organization, as long as the letter of intent identifies the county it's representing, we will accept those letters of intent. When it comes to the application has to come from the county itself. The application submission deadline, again, we focus a lot on these deadlines because they're so important for your grant application to be scored. The deadline is Monday, July 23rd at noon. Applications received after noon will not be accepted, and applications may not be faxed. There is much greater detail on all of these rules for submitting the application that are included in the grant application. So do not rely exclusively on this PowerPoint. Look very carefully at your grant application to make sure that you're following all of the rules. I can't tell you how many times people miss one of the rules for submitting, and then we cannot read the application. So I can't underemphasize enough how important it is to follow those rules. We mentioned that the grant award date announcement of the grants will be made in August of 2018, and the contract will be in place from September 1st, 2018 to August 31st of 2019. We got another question about whether or not we can confirm that we got a letter of intent, and to confirm with an entity if we've received a letter of intent. Kim, if you think you submitted a letter of intent, send an email to Kim. In the subject line, put IGP letter of intent, and then she can let you know if we received the letter of intent. I think at this point we've received 3 or 4.
We have received 5.
We've received 5 letters of intent. We have another question about a cap amount of what can be awarded to each county. There was no cap established, but it is entirely possible that a county, depending on the number of counties that apply and the scoring and the awards, that a requested amount would be reduced. So I would encourage you to make sure that your request is reasonable for purposes of implementing your plan. And the Department of Workforce Services has been known to reduce budget amounts when the request has been outside of what is deemed appropriate for the grant application. So there is no cap, but we have limited funds to award grants to. The application procedure, this is all pretty self-explanatory. Counties must use the provided forms to submit the application. They're fillable PDFs online. If there is a need for additional space to provide a response, complete the response on a separate page and attach it to the application. The applying entity, the county, must bear the cost of preparing and submitting the application. The application must be formatted as outlined. Failure to comply with any part of the RFGA may result in disqualification of the application. This is going back to the previous slide when I said, do not use the PowerPoint. for the detailed instructions for submitting the application. The PowerPoint is just designed for a high-level overview of the application components and the grant requirements. To make sure that you are fully complying, read the application very carefully and make sure that you've reread it before you submit your packet. Application forms must be typed. The forms are created as a savable document, and the PDF forms need to be submitted by email in the original format, not scanned. They must be typed, not handwritten. That's really a benefit to all of you too, because if we can't read your handwriting, that means we can't score the application. So we just have a rule that it has to be submitted in type. Do not staple your application, nor bind them or put them in a binder. Oh, sorry, application must be stapled. Right, so you are required, in addition to the electronic copy, to submit 4 stapled copies to us for the review committee. And we're asking that you staple those 4 copies. Don't use a binder clip or a binder, or bind them formally by going to maybe a printing entity. The application cover sheet must be the first page of the application, and that's where you're going to identify the applying county that's applying for the funds. And the Department of Workforce Services may request the correction of immaterial omissions during the review period. So if something was left out of your application, we may come back to you and give you a period of time to resubmit the materials that have been omitted. We got a question about how many counties have an IGP plan. We know that 13 counties submitted an IGP plan to the Department of Workforce Services last June, but we also know that some counties that did not receive planning grant funds actually followed our format and independently put together IGP plans, and we are not exactly sure how many of those counties might be out there. So we know that there's 13 who absolutely have a plan that was submitted to us last June, and we know of at least 1 county that started to develop their plan on their own, but it's possible there are more than those. Oh, next slide. I'm waiting for the slides to advance. Okay, this again goes into the details of what's in the grant application. You need to submit 1 copy via email. It gives instructions on how to submit that. There has to be 1 original copy that has the original signature of the individual who's affirming the application, and then 4 paper copies. Those are the 4 copies that need to be stapled. Both the paper copies and the email copies must be received no later than 12 p.m. Monday, July 23rd. Late applications will not be accepted, no exceptions. So the paper copies and the email copies must be received no later than 12 noon. Do not include additional information such as personalized cover sheets, tables of contents. Sometimes we think that if we fancy it up a little bit more that it's going to help our case. In this instance, just submit what's being asked, no more than that. There is a submission checklist that's found on page 9 of the packet, and it's pretty much everything that we've just gone over. So I'm not going to spend time on that, but it is a useful tool for you to take advantage of. And now we're going to go into the application forms that are available online, and I think Kara can show you where those application looks like. This is the web page that's on jobs.utah.gov that has the announcement, the eligibility requirements, the application, where we'll post any addendum, and then the questions and answers. Were there specific pieces we should pull out? Will you go to the application, Kara, on that tab?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the entire packet that we're going over in all of the attachments. So you've got the application, you've got the overview RFGA, that's that first bullet, then the grant application cover sheet that we said has to be in first. Then you've got the grant application narrative, which is where you're going to talk about the data and your plan and measures that you're going to track, and then the budget narrative form. Is there anything else we should add to that?
Just making sure when you do the budget narrative form that you are very specific regarding the description of your expenses. We need a detailed description so that we can check it for reasonableness and whether or not it's something that it's an appropriate expense.
You want to go back to the PowerPoint?
Yep, back to the PowerPoint.
Back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so the other pieces that are on there is, I can't really see it, is that we mentioned already that the grant applications will be evaluated and awarded on a competitive basis. Counties must submit one application, do not submit more than one application. If you've got multiple strategies that you're working on, it all needs to be included in that one application. Applicants must be available for presentations upon request and as well as answering any questions. And just so you all know that any successful grant applications will be open to public inspection under GRAMA, the Government Records Access and Management Act. And now I'm going to turn the time, no. Oh, okay. So the next slide shows the score sheet. We talked about that earlier. When you are filling out your narrative, the score sheet aligns with the questions that are asked on that narrative. And it's out of 100 points possible, and program scoring below 60 may not be considered for funding. We have given some priority points, recognizing the importance of trauma-informed care. We've talked about that with the counties and some of our technical assistance trainings. And if your county is willing to consider incorporating trauma-informed care in its model, and you're willing to talk to the Welfare Reform Commission's trauma subcommittee, which is called Resilient Utah, if your county is willing to consider using trauma-informed care and then getting feedback and direction from Resilient Utah, you could get priority points. And all of that is emphasized on this evaluation score sheet. So look at the score sheet carefully and see how the points are being weighted for the application. When we looked at the website, we saw that there are 3 attachments. There's the attachment A, terms and conditions of the grant. There's attachment B, the scope of work, and attachment C, the evaluation score sheet. We had one question about sending the PowerPoint that we're using. We can make that publicly available when we post the recording for the webinar. So that will be available when we post the audio for this webinar. The PowerPoint will accompany the audio. Okay, so Kim is gonna take over and go through the terms of the conditions that are included in the grant contract.
Okay, so these grant terms and conditions will be part of each contract that results from this RFGA. It is important to be familiar with all the requirements and make sure that you're aware of what your responsibilities will be if you're awarded funds. I'm not going to review all of the terms and conditions. I'm just going to hit on some key points, but please keep in mind that you are responsible for everything that is in this document. So the first one that I want to touch on is number 2, governing law and venue. Just, be aware that the agreement is governed by the laws, rules, and regulations of the state of Utah. And then number 3, conflict of interest. When you sign the grant agreement, if you're awarded, you're certifying that none of the owners, directors, officers, or employees are employees of DWS or the state of Utah, and that you will not hire or subcontract with any person having a conflict of interest, and that also that you will notify DWS immediately upon learning of such conflict, and that none of the owners, directors, officers, or employees working under the agreement are relatives of an employee of DWS. All right, and then also, grantees, this is number 4, grantees shall not use grant funds to make any payments to related parties without the prior written consent of DWS. It is important that if there becomes a conflict with a related party, that you contact DWS before making any kind of payment to them. All right, so the next thing I'm going to touch on is number 8, and this is an amendments. The agreements that will be coming out of the RFGA can only be amended, and this includes the scope of work by mutual written agreements of the parties. So if something needs to be changed in the contract, you will need to contact TJ when his information becomes available and speak with him about that, and also have to get DWS's approval, and it will need to be a written amendment. We will not do verbal amendments to the agreement, so just keep that in mind. Grant in number 11, the grantees are responsible for completing the scopes of work under the agreements, and if you subcontract, you are responsible for the subcontractor's compliance under this agreement.
And this will come into play for counties that are subcontracting with other entities, maybe nonprofits or higher education, or whoever the county might be subcontracting with to implement the plan. That's going to come into play. And I also, just talking really quickly in follow-up to the amendment issue, for those of you who contracted with us before for the planning grant and needed to go through the amendment process, I just want to make sure to re-emphasize that the amendment process is not slow. If you call us one day and think that you're going to have an amendment in a week, the unfortunate reality is that it's not going to happen that quickly. I would say the quickest it happens is about a month, and the longest it can happen, depending on delays on your side and DWS's side, it could take as long as 6 weeks. So if in your mind you're thinking you need an amendment, I just want you to make sure you all know that it's a long process.
And we have a question. The question is whether an employee of DWS can be part of the program but not receive grant funding payments. I'm not, without more detail, it's hard to answer that question. DWS will not be receiving grant funds to itself. So if that's how I'm interpreting the question, there would be no expectation that a county would get the money and then return it back to DWS for its involvement in the program. So I hope that that's answering that question. All right.
But yes, they can be part of the program. Sorry, Kim. And we would expect that if your county plan involves workforce services, that we would be represented at the table, as would any of the other agencies that are part of ensuring successful implementation of the county plan.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward with the terms and conditions. If we look at number 14, talking about monitoring, and just to be aware, the DWS has the right to monitor the county's performance under these agreements. And if it is discovered that any of the grantees are in default, that the grantees may be subject to sanctions, which may include warnings, audits, temporary suspension of payments, termination, demand for the return of funds, and or suspension, debarment from participation in future DWS grants and contracts. Default may also result in the cancellation of other agreements between grantee and DWS. So we will obviously give you opportunity to resolve any type of non-compliance. But it is important to note that we can withhold payments or suspend the contract if there is a default. All right, number 15 just talks about default and lists what constitutes default under this contract. You can read through that and see what those are. And then 16 talks about agreement termination, and this covers ways that the agreement may be terminated either for or without cause. And you can read through those as well and just see what those entail. Number 20, agreement renewal. This is a one-year grant, and we do not anticipate extending those grants. I know that Tracy spoke of there could be additional funds left over, and at that time we'll re-release it. But this is a one-year grant, and we will not be extending these grants. Number 21, citing workforce services and grant program promotion. Grantee agrees to give credit to DWS for funding in all written and verbal promotion, marketing, or discussions of this program, including brochures, flyers, informational materials, paid advertisements, social media, etc. All formal promotion, marketing, paid or otherwise, or public information programs will be coordinated with the assigned public information officer for workforce services. When this comes up, if this is something that you're concerned about, you can contact TJ, or you can contact me and we can help you with this. Number 24, compliance with generally applicable state and federal laws. At all times during the agreement, grantee and all services performed under this agreement will comply with all applicable federal and state constitutional laws, rules, codes, orders, and regulations. This includes anti-discrimination and drug-free workplace laws and all laws governing research involving human subjects. It goes into more detail in the terms and conditions, so you'll want to make sure that you read those and that you're familiar with everything that you're expected to be in compliance with. So I'm going to jump to 28. Counties need to have a system in place where recipients of services can provide a grievance if one arises. And number 29, protection and use of client records. The use or disclosure by any party of any personal identifiable information concerning a recipient of services under this agreement for any purpose not directly connected with the administration of DWS or grantee's responsibilities with respect to the agreement is prohibited except as required by law. So we just want to make sure that we're careful with any identifiable information of any of our customers. And then records administration, which is number 30. You'll be responsible to maintain the maintenance of all records necessary to properly account for performance and payments made by DWS under this agreement. The records must be retained for at least 6 years after the final payment or until all audits initiated within the 6 years have been completed, whichever is later. Please make sure to retain all records and documents regarding this grant. And 31, grantee agrees that this agreement, invoices, and supporting documentation will be public documents and may be available for public and private distribution in accordance with the State of Utah's Government Records Access Management Act. 33, financial reporting. Grantee shall comply with all applicable federal and state laws and regulations regarding financial reporting and auditing. Number 34 is billings and payments. And payments will be made by DWS upon receipt of itemized billing for authorized services supported by appropriate documentation and information contained in reimbursement forms supplied by DWS. DWS will provide you with an invoice in which to send to initiate the reimbursement process. You will also need to provide all supporting documentation, receipts, everything that goes along with that to support the expenses that you are trying to recoup. And then an important note is DWS must receive billing for services for the month of June no later than July 15th. So the final month of this agreement, we must have the final invoice no later than July 15th. Payment withholding, reporting, and record keeping are material elements of performance for this contract. If it is determined that the grantees or the counties are not keeping records and reporting to DWS as is required under the contract, that payments may be withheld, part or all, under the agreement until the deficiencies are resolved. And then number 39, financial cost accounting system. Grantee agrees to maintain a financial and cost accounting system in accordance with accounting principles generally accepted.
There's a question about sharing information. This is kind of a tricky question to have a clear answer on. There's different ways that the counties will obtain information about people utilizing their services. If you are obtaining information about families utilizing services and you don't get that information from DWS or one of its other agencies, which you shouldn't be getting that information anyway, you will need to check with your legal departments and with the agencies that are collecting the information on the families to evaluate whether or not that information can be shared. I know that if you have a program that's in place at your schools and the school is serving the family, the likelihood that they can give another entity information about that family is incredibly slim without getting consent information from the parents. So you will have to take that up probably as you're designing the program. It is an issue that's going to arise. And to the extent that Workforce Services and the commission member agencies can help navigate that with you, we're happy to do so, but there's just no real easy answer because it kind of depends on what information you want to share, how you're collecting it, and the policies of the entities that are actually doing the collection.
All right, and then the last section that I want to go over in the terms and conditions, it's already been touched on by Tracy. It's administrative expenditures. This is number 41, and it's basically just reiterating that administrative expenses is limited to 10% of the budget, and that does include the 25% from the counties as well as whatever is awarded from DWS. All right, and then just make sure that you are familiar with everything that is in the terms and conditions. I did not review them all. I just went through and picked out some of the more things that I wanted to cover a little more in depth and make sure that you are aware of. All right, that's all I have on the terms and conditions, and so I'm going to turn this back over to Tracy.
I think that completes our overview of the application. Hopefully you had a chance to ask your questions. Like we mentioned before, there is an opportunity for you to submit questions after this concludes by writing to Kim, and she will answer those questions online on that web page. But we will allow a few more minutes for your questions to come in. We did get we did get a question. If a county received a $100,000 grant and matched it with $25,000, so the total amount would be $125,000, you would only, the admin cap on that would be 10% of that $125,000. So the math that's up there is correct. Any other questions that you can present in the chat feature for us to answer? We will be making this available once the recording is ready and we've corrected some of the typos that we had in terms of the timeline. We'll make sure to get those questions answered. We do have some questions about allowable expenses. I don't know if you want to enter those questions in the chat feature or if you'd rather submit them in writing to Kim and then we can respond to them. It's up to you if you want to enter those questions about allowable expenses. And it looks like they would like to ask questions about allowable expenses. And we'll give you a couple minutes to type your question in while everybody's waiting and see if we can answer them for you. This is general fund money, so there is some flexibility on it, but the money is really designed to implement the plans, not to kind of staff up on administration, but actually serve the families to move the needle for intergenerational poverty, so and improve outcomes that align with the Commission's 5 and 10-year plan. So that's part of the reason for that 10% admin cap, recognizing where there have been concerns in the past about expenditures and efforts similar to this one. So I appreciate everybody's patience and indulgence while we wait for this question to come through. And if there are any other questions, feel free to write those in as well. Have we had any other? No, we're just waiting on this one. Okay.
Just put the answers in his website.
Okay, can you scroll up to that question so we can see the full question that was asked on that chat? Looks like it came through. Scholarship tuition for technical college. I would say yes, that it could be used for that, unless, of course, we mentioned that if there are scholarships and tuitions out there that this population could take advantage of or leverage or utilize that already are in existence and it's a duplication, you would have to explain how this is not a duplication. Marketing materials and advertising, yes. Transportation such as shuttle service, again, if that's a duplication, then that would probably be something that we would scrutinize when you put in your narrative. Again, Kim mentioned the importance of providing a program narrative that's comprehensive. That's going to help us answer these questions without coming back to you for more information. I think just basically looking at all of this, it really is a question about what the money is being used for, and I think that each of the counties are going to have to explain how utilizing the money for those purposes are going to align with the Commission's 5 and 10-year plans and the outcomes that you're going to be tracking for these families. We are looking at plans that are going to be implemented that are going to make a difference and improve outcomes and for both the families and the children. So there would have to be really clear explanation on all of these funding sources in the role that they're going to play to improve outcomes for the families. Travel, mileage for home visits, it's all the same. You will have to explain how the needed money is not a duplication and that how it aligns with the Commission's 5 and 10-year plan and the outcomes that you will be tracking for families. Any other questions? Appropriate for the county to be, yes, the county has to be the lead agency. The county or groups of counties have to be the lead agency. So that's the only entity that's appropriate to serve as the lead agency. So that was another question that came up. And I'm hoping that you all can see the questions that are coming through. Does the program have to be specific for children? No. I encourage you to read the Commission's 5 and 10-year plans and look at those 4 areas of child well-being so that as you're designing your county plan, hopefully if you submitted your county plan in June, you know what your county plan is, and this funding is for your plan itself that's already been submitted to DWS and reviewed. But if there's any question, I encourage you to look at the Commission 5 and 10-year plans and look at the goals in each of those areas of child well-being so you know what your options are. But we're hopeful that the money's being used to implement plans that were already submitted last June. Any other questions? Well, with that, we thank you for your time today. We will make sure to make the recording available. And again, just ask us any questions that you might have submitted to Kim, and we'll get those responses put up. And thanks again for your time. Have a great day.